I'd like to welcome all of our listeners to this special midweek installment of IGN Digigods. This is Wade Major on behalf of Mark Kaiser, and we recently spoke with Lynda Obst, the extraordinary producer of so many classics, including Adventures in Babysitting, The Fisher King, Sleepless in Seattle, Contact, The Siege, Hope Floats, and currently who is executive producer of television's Hot in Cleveland. Lynda Obst, of course, wrote the famous memoir Hello, He Lied in 1996. And here we are nearly 20 years later, and she has written something of a sequel to that entitled Sleepless in Hollywood, Tales from the New Abnormal in the Movie Business, which we thought was extremely important to discuss, as the book speaks directly to a lot of the issues that many of our listeners and film fans in general find so important right now, namely what's happened to the movie business in just the last decade. What does it mean for people who love movies right now, who love to make movies right now, and what does it mean going forward? What are movies going to look like in the future? Mark and I have both read the book. We think it is extremely important for our listeners and for movie fans in general, and we thought that an in-depth interview with Lynda about the book and its contents merited a special off-week, midweek installment of the show. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Lynda Obst.
I am here talking with Lynda Obst, producer extraordinaire who has written an incredible new book, Sleepless in Hollywood. And it's, in many ways, I guess we could say it's a sequel to Hello, He Lied, that sort of picks up and fills in all the blanks about what happened in the interim. And that's so fascinating because I honestly think not only is this better than your first book, I would say this is the most important book for anyone who is working or wants to work in the film business, I would say since William Goldman's Adventures in the Screen Trade. I think it sort of it fills in the blanks and it unravels this Rubik's Cube of what the industry has become. Could you talk just for a second about... You start the book saying that you had to figure out what was going on, that everybody was scratching their heads, and the book is really your process in putting all of that together. Talk just for a moment about the impetus behind that.
Well, I was at Paramount at a very critical moment. I had gone there to be with Sherry Lansing, whom I loved, who had brought me to the studio from an incredibly happy period at Fox, where it was very easy to make movies for a number of reasons, but one of which is that they have a very verticalized model. They own all their ancillaries. So a producer could figure out what it took to get a movie made. It had to be able to sell to any number or combination of their ancillaries. And by ancillaries, I mean their DVD market, their VOD market, their... I don't even know if there was one back then, but their international market or their satellite market or their television stations, they owned all of their ancillaries. And so if you hit enough of the boxes or at a certain price point, you could get a picture made with a good argument to very good executives who also happen to read. And but I left because I was courted by Sherry and John Goldwyn to finally make first dollar profits on my movies. I never had.
Which is incredible to me. I mean, with the success that you have, that you didn't have that before. But anyway.
You know, looking back, it was incredible to me, too. And, you know, if you saw the Lily Ledbetter case, there is a certain degree of women getting less than men.
Yeah.
Getting paid less than men, and at the same time I was raising a son, and I needed the upfront fees, which were always paid against. You know, I needed the upfront guarantee because I was, you know, a single mom. So if I had been independently wealthy, I might have been able to trade off for back-end points, do you know?
Yeah.
But I wasn't, do you know?
Yeah.
So Sherry thought it was horrible and said, you're going to make first dollar gross here. So I left my very happy home, went to Paramount, And then it proceeded to go through sort of a series of cataclysmic changes over the 8 years that I was there. In many ways, it was a turning of a battleship from during one paradigm shift to another. During John Dolgen and the Sherry Lansing administration, his idea was not market share, but profitability. So he wanted to report the highest possible profits to his board. So he would make the movie for the lowest price possible. And when I say that, I mean the lowest price possible.
Yeah, I mean, you say that in the book. You talk about the frugality being the he and Sherry had that it was their battle that always resulted in the budget.
It was a very creative, dynamic battle for them. They were,
yeah.
And they still are, incredibly close friends. So the partnership worked for them. Sherry had her gut, so she could pick whatever pictures she wanted based on nothing but her gut. And I believe in gut. That was what was great about the team. And she picked some phenomenal hits in the early part of her reign. Phenomenal hits. You know, we're talking Forrest Gump and Braveheart and, you know, I mean, just a phenomenal series of original one-off international hits. But, of course, they didn't think about international in those days, right?
Right.
And so what they did is they sold off all of their other rights in order to bring down the costs. So they sold off usually the DVD. They sold off international, which is unheard of these days. It's like criminal. It would never be done. They sold off all of the valuable rights that are on their P&L, and they would just keep domestic. In the case of How to Lose a Guy, they didn't even keep domestic. They just held on to DVD, which is unbelievably ironic given what happened a few years later to the DVD market and my profits.
Yeah.
But, which were only based on Paramount's, right, not the overall profits of the film, because they were owned by some German tax shelter.
Right.
But whatever good deal John could make, because he was a former business affairs executive, he would make to lower the cost of the picture so he could report to the board, look, this picture only costs X, right?
Yeah.
And then the producer would always have to cut their fee because producers want to go to production so much that at the end of the day, just as they got their budget down to the bone, then they said, one more cut. Then they would cut the producer's fee because they can't cut the writer's fee. They're protected by the guild. They can't cut the director's fee. He's big talent. And they can't cut the movie star's fees, right?
Right.
Now they're doing that, but rarely, but sometimes, right? So, but usually studios can't cut actors' fees. So once they got so that was their model, was to do the most penurious. And that was a shock to me when I got there, obviously. Now, during that regime, it worked for a while until the onslaught, until two things happened. The collapse of the DVD market, as Peter Chernin explains in the book, which had been 50% of the profit margin, the cushion of profits in the movie industry for a good long time. People were buying the library. People were buying DVDs of their favorite movies. And that was the most critical portion of the profit and loss statements that the studios had been making to justify their green light to their boards. And when the DVD collapsed, the studios were frozen in what to do. That was the point at which I realized that I couldn't get any answers on my material. But by then, Sherry and John were gone. And they were gone, but for different reasons. Because, and this is also connected to the change between the new and old abnormal, Sherry and John, with their penurious model, could not react to the giant onslaught, the incredible onslaught of special effect-driven pictures that suddenly started hitting the market at the exact same time as the DVD collapse. There was Shrek and Harry Potter, and then eventually, of course, Titanic, which Sherry bought half of and bought domestic of.
Which was
so
brilliant.
She certainly had the gut to buy that, right?
Yeah.
And one of her most brilliant moves. But they couldn't buy them for development. They couldn't buy them to make them because they were too expensive. And their penurious model didn't allow them to buy those scripts and then to make them in-house, because suddenly they were making $200 million movies, 150 and 250 to million movies. And those weren't the kinds of movies that the Dolgen model allowed. And they didn't realize, who did, that this was going to change the world forever, that our technology was going to turn out to be critical to the enduring success of the new model and what would eventually become the replacement of the DVD cushion and the lifeblood of new profits for the movies. I don't think anyone realized at that first moment how the success ultimately of Titanic and then Avatar and then all of these movies would fundamentally transform the movie business. But Sherry and John were ultimately replaced. They weren't replaced. John was replaced. Tom Freston came in. Sherry chose to leave. Brad Gray came in, created a new team who were very internationally focused. So during the time I was at Paramount, the whole ship turned around into the opposite model, from what I call the old abnormal model based on gut and one-offs, right?
Yeah.
To the new abnormal model, which was based on what would please the international market that was now dominating the profits.
Which is franchises and superheroes and sequels and all the rest of it.
And pre-awareness, anything that could be sequelized. When you sequelize a movie, by the second iteration, it can become double its value in the international market. By the third, even more, and then more and more as the iterations proceed, because sequels are a form of pre-awareness. Just like Superman is a form of pre-awareness. We all have heard of it, right?
Yeah.
And Batman is a form of pre-awareness.
Well, I think... I was going to say, not to interrupt, but, this summer has been interesting if you look at everything from Superman to Iron Man to The Lone Ranger. They're all properties that are, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, let me...
It doesn't matter. I mean, sometimes one of the reasons they have such pre-awareness is because they're so old.
Right.
It's hard to create a property with pre-awareness that's new.
Yeah.
The reason they're old is because we heard of them somehow in the dim past, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we have to reboot it, reinvent it, give it effects that give it the sense of modernity. This is the third iteration of Superman?
Yeah.
And with X-Men, right, it's an old property, but it's done with new effects. And then after one series of sequels, it gets rebooted into a new set of sequels. So the job of the studio machine is to keep creating a sense of freshness about properties that are essentially very old. And this is why the IPs have become important, things we used to call books, right?
Right.
Hunger Games, Harry Potter. Those are the only competitive properties with pre-awareness that aren't, from our parents' childhood, that aren't from the vault.
One of the things that I found so rewarding in reading the book is that you crystallized all of the thoughts that I go on radio every month and on this podcast every week, and anyone who listens to me has heard me complain about these things for years, and I've never been able to sort of put it all together in one kind of grand map like you did. And you refer to the two different kinds of films, the tent poles and the tadpoles. Tent poles being the great big pre-recognition things the studios are making. They spend $200 million making them, another $150 million marketing them, and then all that's left are the little movies. And I've kind of, from my discussions, I've distilled that down to big movies with no ideas and little movies that are nothing but ideas. And there's nothing in between anymore, which used to kind of be Hollywood's bread and butter.
Those are the kinds of movies I used to make.
Exactly. I mean, Sleepless in Seattle, all those great romantic comedies that you made, those are the middle. The Godfather was the middle. All the President's Men was the middle. Lawrence of Arabia, Sound of Music. These are all kind of movies that sit in that place, and they don't really. The studios don't do that anymore. And through much of your book, I was looking for that glimmer of hope, and I was looking for something to hang on to. Is there a way? And then you have that wonderful interview at the end. With Michael Linton, and where he basically kind of says, no, it's you can't keep doing the superhero stuff, the fireballs and the tights, it's going to eventually run its course, and those foreign audiences that are driving that will eventually become as sophisticated as American audiences, and perhaps
right.
we'll move back to that place. And I was so glad that the book had that trajectory. And I'm not giving anything away here because it's I think people need to read it beginning to end to really wrap their heads around this whole new paradigm. But is that a correct assessment? Do you feel like there is room for those movies again? Will they come back? Will there be a place for them, at least on the level that they used to be?
Well, I think it's important to note that Michael Lynton is the CEO of Sony, which is clearly one of our very best studios. They made The Social Network. They made Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. They made Moneyball. They're the
only ones who are doing something different. I mean, this came out of just recently at the annual show for exhibitors. They were the only ones who showed up in New York with a really diversified slate. Everyone else kind of came with the same old tentpole formula, and Sony showed up with a really big and broad and very diversified slate.
And part of the reason for that is that the partnership between Michael Lynton and Amy Pascal is a true partnership, and it's unique. Michael Lynton truly understands the international business. He understands conceptually the movie business. He's quite a brilliant man. He's educated. And Amy Pascal has gut. And I think it's my fundamental belief that people cling to formulas in the movie business every so many years because they're terrified of gut. There's no component in the profit and loss statement for how good is this picture.
Yeah.
Do you believe in this picture? Why do you think this picture is going to work? It's all quantified. They're terrified of qualifications. They want quantifications. But the truth is, the longer a studio's reign is successful, it's because there's a person at its helm with a gut. At the end of the day, you have to read and have instincts. That's why the early studio moguls are good. Because you can't pick every picture you love. You have to pick the best pictures that you love. You have to know what's good. You have to know who to put as director. You have to oversee that picture. You have to do it for a price. And then you have to hire the right actors. So it's a process that involves talent. So yes, I do think that I'm kind of a dialectician. I'm kind of a Hegelian. I admit it's very out of fashion.
Which is a great part of the book, too.
But I think that there are only so many ways you can destroy the same cities over and over again without it becoming completely numbing.
Yeah.
There are only so many times we can see the White House go down, or we can see Paris burn, or we can, when it's not real, or we can see gigantic machines blowing up, or cars turning into monsters and robots. I mean, it ultimately becomes demoralizing, which is why the domestic audience is so much more discerning about the good tentpoles like Fast and Furious, which I might add was created. It was an original, not based on an ancient property. From the bad ones, which are more cynically created to just be based on effects. Now, the international audience, you have to realize, was just introduced to these same movies years after we were, right?
Yeah.
So they're pre-adolescents when it comes to their joy in seeing this kind of spectacularum.
Well, I think the telling thing in your book with respect to that is when you talk about your meeting with Jim Giannopoulos, who showed you the profit structure for the Ice Age films, where they're effectively making the same amount each installment domestically, but they're exponentially more successful overseas.
Exactly, because that's pre-awareness.
Yeah.
And the fundamental issue here, and this is why sequels are so important, I call that the definition of sequelitis, is because you cannot market internationally the way we market domestically. In the old days, when the domestic audience was 80% of the market, you could open a movie like Sleepless or a movie like The Fisher King or any of the romantic comedies I made by selling television ads all over the country. And if they liked them and they liked the trailers, people would go.
Yeah.
Now, if you try to do that internationally, it would be absolutely impossible cost-wise. You can't
Right.
sell television ads all over the world. So they have to already know the name of the movie and know they want to go to it. The only power of the domestic audience is if they heard it was a hit in America, it helps, and it triggers a certain amount of spending overseas automatically. That's how Bridesmaids made it overseas.
Right.
No one thought that it was going to ever play overseas. 4 unknown women from television. But it had triggered such a high number domestically that it had to open a certain number of movies overseas. And then lo and behold, 4 unknown women were a hit overseas as well. That's how we break new international stars. So the marketing costs make it so difficult for a one-off to succeed or a movie that can't sequelize to succeed. That's what happened to dramas and comedies, and most critically romantic comedies. They're not sequelizable. But you see that a movie like Ice Age that begins to not be significant in the domestic audience becomes wildly important in the international audience, where it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. I looked at that list when Jim showed it to me. He said, "Do you know what this means?" And I said, "Yes, it means he'll be making Ice Ages forever."
Yeah.
Ice Age forever. And we'll sit here and go, "Why are they making another Ice Age?" And now we'll know why.
You know, and on that note, there's something else that you mentioned which really hit me like a lightning bolt in the Paramount chapter, where you said that a market share is more important than profitability. And that sort of dovetails with something that I've always complained about, which is the way in which corporate ownership has changed all of these businesses. And you know, I'm one of my saying people have heard me say a million times is, you know, the 2 things that should not be publicly owned: sports teams and studios. Because you know, we all saw what happened when we had corporate ownership of, you know, the Angels and the Ducks, and how that it removed that personal gut thing that you're talking about, that Sherry used her gut. The old moguls had their gut. You know, that Amy Pascal has a great gut. I mean, it's such a part of the business. But you can't, like you said, you can't put it on a profit and loss statement. You can't go to the board and say, invest in my gut. You can't have your shareholder phone call and say, my gut's doing really well this month. And it just seems to me that if we really want great movies, the corporate structure, having to worry about quarterly earnings, having to worry about market share, seems directly at odds with everything that makes movies good, that gives audiences what they want. I mean, is that a correct assessment?
Well, it's quite brilliant, actually. There's nothing we can do about it, but it's quite brilliant, because I remember in the middle of writing this book, I ran into Lynda Janklow, who was the daughter of Mervyn LeRoy, the granddaughter, I think, of Harry Warner, right?
Yeah.
And she said to me, the whole thing changed when they had to start writing quarterly reports. That's when the movie business changed. And that's the freedom that the old moguls had. And I think it's astonishing that you just hit that on the head like that. But the fact is that there are ways in which this moves forward. As a Hegelian, I think we can move forward, but we can't move backwards, right? We're not going to undo the corporate structure or the corporate ownership of the studios. So we have to let the intrinsic seeds of the destruction of the model undo themselves, and then take pieces of the new abnormal that work and continue them, because we need the profits from global market. There are good things about globalization we can discuss, but then take the stupid parts of it, the tent poles that are hugely expensive and not interesting to anyone, that are made cynically for huge amounts of money and huge amounts of marketing money, and be discerning about them, and not make those, and take that $250 million and break it down into a number of smaller movies that are guaranteed by their quality, if not, you know, and that's where gut is required. And each studio usually makes one shot for the Oscars. Make one shot for the market, not just the Oscars, do you know?
Right, yeah.
And allow a $200 million hit or a $100 million hit, or even a movie that makes $70 million domestically. That used to be fine for the business. As long as it doesn't lose money,
right?
You know, as long as it makes a margin of profit, I mean, literally, my best rom-coms would make $220 million profits, and it doesn't seem to be sufficient anymore. And I sort of feel like bears make money and pigs go to slaughter.
Yeah.
Eventually, aiming for these billion-dollar babies are going to bring too many $400 million business enterprises down, and that's what Steven Spielberg was talking about.
Right, I was going to make mention of that too. Obviously, Spielberg talking about that, and then we had Soderbergh's keynote at the San Francisco Film Society, which sort of got everybody talking about all these issues as well. And he talking about going into television, and then there's that great section in your book about television, which all sort of defines this new paradigm, because that's the flip side, I think, to what Giannopoulos was saying with the foreign versus domestic market. Are when you show an amazing chart that shows just how huge television has become exponentially larger than the movie divisions. Maybe that'll be the tail that wags the dog, perhaps.
Well, what are we all talking about on Monday mornings? Do you know?
Yeah.
Sunday night TV, cable TV, right? And the networks are getting better. I mean, basically, the absence of the necessity of great writing in movies has driven great writers to join their partners in television. They're the boss in television. They don't have to resolve their stories by the third act. It's all character-driven.
Yeah.
It's the complete reverse of what's required in writing features right now.
And where perhaps those people will acquire the power and the clout to be able to come back and help make changes in the movie end, perhaps.
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
Some of them I don't think JJ is making great changes in the movie industry.
No.
But they sure will get clout, and let's see what they do with it. Do you know?
Right.
David Chase chose to make a small indie, but he can do whatever he wants. Do you know? I think that the businesses are a big mush pot now. Do you know?
Yeah.
Entertainment is entertainment. Soon we'll be all watching them on one device. Although I do think the theatrical experience in a theater is still very important. Movie business has all this glamour, but the television business has all the money. And by the way, that was always true. When I came to town, I heard this expression that was, if you want a good table at Morton's, be in the movie business.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want a house in Malibu, go into television.
Right.
But the movie people just got all the attention.
Well, I mean, when I was growing up, I remember the wealthiest people in the business were Norman Lear and Merv Griffin, and that was entirely television generated, and nobody really gave them quite the same respect that they gave, some of the movie people. So it was. You're right.
They had to sit upstairs at the Golden Globes.
Yeah, right. That's right. Now, here's something that I wanted to ask you about as well, because the demise of all the independent divisions. You were just saying, that your bears and pigs comment. We need those profitability, those constant profit generators. And all the independent divisions were doing so well. The studios acquired them and created them over a period of time, good solid decade, when they were really pretty much consistently profitable, whether it was New Line, Picture House, Miramax, Paramount Classics, Warner Independent, Focus. I mean, at Fox Searchlight, obviously, Sony Classics, they were the two golden children of all of that. But now, apart from Sony Classics and Searchlight, and Focus is kind of on the bubble, the others were all completely obliterated in about an 18-month period around 2005 and 2006. And yet, in your book, you talk about how the studios do invest in independence in local areas, in India and Germany and so forth, where they're making local romantic comedies for the local market because there is a market for them. But there's still a market for them here. Why do you think they gave up on that principle domestically, yet they still pursue it foreign?
I think there isn't enough money in it for the studios. It costs them a lot of money to do, and the profits aren't significant enough for the studios, given the amount of overhead and whatever is involved in the startups. Paramount had a very good start to its new division because John Lesher brought all of his projects as an agent over from Endeavor. So he had that very good start, and still those movies get a lot of attention, and they don't generate a lot of profits. Clearly the most successful have survived. It was Darwinian, and it was the time of the recession. So they grew during the boom, and they died during the recession. like very many other businesses. So when you have people at the top with gut, like Peter Rice and Nancy Utley, who ran Searchlight, and like Jim Shamus, who runs Focus, they survived, right?
Right.
Michael Barker, I think his name is, who runs Sony Classics, is really good. So once again, in a Darwinian situation, the talent rises to the top, and so you see those divisions succeed. Also, Fox and Sony have had the resources to sustain them. But what you saw with the tadpoles, with the indies, is that micro minis with HD, it made pictures much less expensive to make. So they were no longer reliant on film, so they didn't have to be made at the prices that the mini majors were making them for. So after the recession, the independent market turned into a micro mini independent market, where there were I would almost say scores of thousands of new pictures made because it became so inexpensive to make them. Scores of thousands of new ones were submitted to festivals, but didn't get in necessarily because of the volume. But now there are new venues like YouTube and all sorts of new internet venues in which they can be shown and then later discovered. I hope they do finally get seen. And there, once again, movie stars are your friends. Those movies are all getting made practically for free, with no crew getting paid, which makes me sad. But they're getting made because actors want to work in valuable properties. Yeah. In good scripts. Writers are working for free.
But this is a little concerning for those who want to make a living at this going forward.
This is my concern.
Is everything becoming too fractured and fragmented? I've seen it both in the film business and in publishing. We've seen it in music business. We see musicians who say, my song just got played 1 million times on Pandora, and they just sent me a check for $10. Yeah. So, the question is there? It was one thing in 1968. When you only had 3 networks and you could be a great show, and because somebody had to pick one of the 3, and even if you were number 3, you were still getting tens of millions of people watching you. Or when there were only so many movies opening, and there weren't all these other competing forces for our attention. But now everything has been democratized to the point where we can see everything all the time. And your interview with Linton talks about that as well, where he says things need to be a little bit difficult. If you have too much food in front of you, you're going to overeat. If you have too much alcohol, you're going to drink too much. It seems now we have too many choices, and it's making it hard for people to earn a living.
Well, I think a few things about that. I think you're right on a lot of these things. I think, for one thing, some movies are being starved to the point of reductio ad absurdum. Nobody's getting paid, and those movies, they're very hard to get seen. And so all of this starvation and hard work and dedication and passion is going into projects that ultimately won't get seen, and that makes me sad. And that's possibly a technological transition until we have sufficient amount of venues where people can find niche films. But we don't know exactly what's going to occur on the Internet in terms of additional venues and how we're going to find the films we're looking for, or if there's ever going to be a place for this many micro-minis. On the other hand, you asked me about what was your second question?
Well, that when there's too much, it's too fragmented, is anyone going to be able to make a living? And at some point, how do you make a living?
Right. Okay, so right now you can't make a living that way. What it's best for is talent. Okay, there used to be no way whatsoever to become a director. Okay, literally, writers who had been writing hits for 20 years didn't have any footage, so no one would hire them. People keep saying women aren't directors. Women aren't directors. Women aren't directors. Why is that happening? If a woman sits down right now, uses her credit cards and her iPad or and gets some cheap HD equipment, and gets all the favors, she can get it on YouTube, she can get a bunch of hits, and she can get represented and get hired for a studio production. No one knows if it's a girl or a guy that put that great short on YouTube. My son is now representing a Brazilian director who put a short, a fabulous-looking, stylish short on YouTube. It got 100,000 hits. Everybody was after it, and now he's directing a movie for Universal.
Wow.
So it circumvents the gatekeepers and allows talent to show their wares. So technologically, it's great for talent. It's not great necessarily for the final product because
Right.
it's too hard to find the final product. So in terms of making a living, that's why I like television, okay?
Yeah.
Because there are so many new and growing venues in television where you can actually find them on your screen, either on your computer screen or on your television screen, and soon that will be one entity on your iPad. They are open to original ideas. You have to learn the business. It took me a couple of years of being pretty stupid. But television is not, it's a place in which you can make a living. It's a place in which the new venues require new models. Webisodes can turn into television ideas, so you can create them as webisodes and then recreate them for television. And there are so many proliferating platforms that there were 4 born last year. Who knows how many there'll be in 4 years?
Right.
And you can grow from webisodes to an outlying venue to cable. Do you know?
Yeah.
That's a pattern that you can build a career through. You can get your work seen.
And it's changing every day, it seems.
Every day.
Yeah.
The speed of that is exciting, as opposed to the pace of features.
Yeah. You know, one of the kind of the subtextual threads of the book that I so enjoyed is it has a good feminist strain to it, and I think it's clear there's no coincidence that the characters that really shine in the book are women who seem to have a clue when the men don't. Sherry Lansing, obviously most notably, but also Sue Kroll, who just since in the last couple of weeks now is part of the new triumvirate over there at Warner Brothers. So it certainly seems like, and then of course Amy Pascal. It seems like on a certain level, you can't read your book without getting the sense that women have better instincts than men, at least in the current corporate environment. And yet, Susanna Orozco's spec script analysis just recently found that spec sales by women, by female writers, plummeted over the last number of years, and were practically halved once we got into that period that you call the Great Contraction. Nora Ephron, good friend of yours, and Dawn Steele, you say in the book was your best friend, and I'm just wondering, do you feel like we're maybe in a transitional place, because obviously it's not great for women in some sense, certainly for female writers right now, but it seems to be really good for women who are in executive and leadership positions who are scaling the studio ranks. Nina Jacobson being another one who, producing the Hunger Games
she made a franchise for women.
You quote her in the book as talking about the future is for women. The franchise of the future of women. So I'm almost seeing like two different messages being sent by the industry right now. What if you're kind of talking to women who are trying to find a place in the business? Do they take solace in the one, or should they be concerned about the other? Where do they kind of what do you see as their future?
Well, there are two different issues, okay? Because the reason, first of all, there are very few spec sales at all, okay?
Yeah.
But the spec sales that they will buy obviously will be congruent with the kinds of movies they want to make. And if they're making movies for the foreign market, and if they're trying to make big action movies that have huge special effects that they know they can sell in China and Russia, women have to write them to get their spec script sold. If they write big science fiction, they can get their spec script sold. Women have to look at the market and see what can they do that's getting sold. All the women that I know, that I work with, write romantic comedies, Yeah. And we were trained to write romantic comedies because that's what we did best and that's what we knew best. And right now is the most fallow period for romantic comedy since I've been in the business. There are a few reasons for that, one of which is the last 4 were horrendous and cynical and badly cast. Ever since the 2 that worked, which were the Mila Kunis one and the Natalie Portman one, right? Both of which worked. But they would much rather generalize from the ones that didn't work. But the real reason is because they can't be sequelized.
Yeah.
No one wants to know what happens after the couple gets together. Do they get divorced? Do they have kids? Do they break up? Do they go to a bar? You know, I mean, that can't be sequelized. So if it can't be sequelized, it doesn't fit into a franchise model, and therefore it's not in the business plan. As I said before, my most successful romantic comedies made $200 million all in, and those are not the level of profits they're looking for. So the romantic comedy model doesn't fit in. They don't say that explicitly. What they say is women don't go to the movies. They'll go to men's movies if they're good, but men will never go to women's movies. Those are the religious principles.
Which I find so wrong. I mean, it was women who dragged men to see Titanic, which in your book is the turning point. So I'm still amazed that prevailed.
I had men at Sleepless. I had men at How to Lose a Guy. Women went to Something's Gotta Give. Men went to Something's Gotta Give. If a movie is good and women go, women will take their dates.
Yeah.
If men aren't offended by it, and often if men are, they're like Sex and the City, there's enough women to compensate for it.
Yeah.
So, and they're hungry for their movies. Every time a woman's movie does well, they're convinced, like Bridesmaids, which shocked everybody, both domestically and internationally, the studios convinced themselves it's about the stars, not the audience. Because, of course, we were all watching Mike and Molly before Bridesmaids, right?
Right.
Now Melissa McCarthy is an international star, and we'll be seeing Melissa McCarthy movies as opposed to 4 women comedies.
And I found it interesting. As I finished the book, you were talking about The Heat, which, as it happens, opens this week. And so that'll be interesting to see, because that's quite smart counter-programming, a female buddy cop movie opening against some pretty big tent poles.
Brilliant. I think I said it was a brilliant idea, and I was jealous of Peter when he came up with it.
It's brilliant. It is. It really is brilliant, and the casting couldn't be better. It could not. I mean, there are no two female stars who are hotter at this point in time. I mean, it really
and
is
internationally.
Inspired. It's inspired. It's really inspired. So I mean, I'm hoping that really works.
Peter understands the business.
Yeah. I would talk for a second as we kind of start to wrap this up. You have a wonderful image that you use to substitute for the old, really dry quadrant speak by making each quadrant a pie. And later in the book, you point out how the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel clearly kind of defies that model by hitting an upper end of a quadrant rather than 2, which is sort of the industry gospel, right? You have to hit 2 quadrants, or there's no point. And here's one that hit a fringe of a quadrant, and it made a couple $100 million around the world. Does that give filmmakers who perhaps don't want to necessarily subscribe to this gospel, does that give them hope that perhaps there are other ways of splitting up an audience than just those 4 quadrants? Can we slice this up and maybe kind of take a step outside the box and see it from a different point of view?
Well, I think it makes directors and writers, particularly in England, it gives them a model to argue from, and you have to cast it, obviously, with the same people that you put in the King's Speech, and and Helen Mirren, of course, and Jeremy Irons, and whomever else was, and Judi Dench, and whomever else was in the Exotic Marigold Hotel. But I don't think it's going to incline the studios to do another Cocoon necessarily. Now, there is something about the international audience that's quirky and likes older stars because they love the stars of the immediate past. So if you put Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger and their young ward, The Rock, and Helen Mirren, and let's see, who's one really older star? Sean Connery in a movie.
Sure.
Do you know?
Yeah.
That might perform internationally, but not necessarily in the new markets that they're chasing.
Let me wrap up by asking you about.
You need a really big explosion, or put in.
Right. Let me wrap up by asking you whether or not there's room for some really inventive new business models, because obviously we have this situation where the only people who can release movies on thousands of screens are the studios, and as we talked about earlier, the studios are corporate owned. So you do have this conundrum that you don't have, say, an independently owned, privately owned entity that could put you on thousands of screens, where somebody doesn't have to worry about their gut being questioned by the board or an earnings report or whatever. We have some interesting models now. You obviously have the Lionsgate and Summit model, and there's Open Road, which I've been kind of fascinated by, where we now have this vertically integrated company that is essentially a couple of exhibitors who have hired Tom Ortenberg, formerly of Lionsgate, to acquire and release movies. And a lot of studios were really upset when that happened, because they felt like it was, the exhibitors thumbing their noses and saying, we're not going to give you our screens, we're going to get our own movies for our screens. But Open Road's doing pretty well, it seems. Do you think that Open Road is an interesting model, and might that be a harbinger of things to come? There are more opportunities for companies that can come in and, say, grab more than, top 40 markets, that can maybe start to release movies on thousands of screens and really compete with the studios. Is there a chance of that?
I don't know, It's been historically hard to compete with the studios. They have all the product that the exhibitors want, So if there gets to be too much of this, I think the studios will exercise their power.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of ways that the model may change. And that may be one way that new distributors can get a foothold for their own films. But if there start to be too many and they take too many screens, the studios own the power of the vast number of screens,
Yeah.
because most of them are chains, and they need the big product. But I think we should think about other areas of potential change that fascinate me as a Hegelian.
Yeah.
One of them is how much indigenous production is going on, international indigenous production. The goal of all of these countries is not to have 17 out of 20 of their pictures be American, right?
Right.
China has huge quotas on the American pictures coming in, and they're building 10 screens a day. And this year, far ahead of schedule, they've had $2 billion indigenous pictures. The more an economy is growing, the more it's going to want to ascertain our technology, copy it, and create it so they have all the profits, right?
Right.
So as indigenous, and that's why Fox International Pictures was so brilliant as to get into co-financing with indigenous productions. They started making indigenous romantic comedies, helping, our romantic comedies die, right? Because people would rather see romantic comedies in their own culture. As our numbers, if they start putting quotas on American pictures, as they start developing our technology in their own way, and fewer of our pictures are allowed in some of those more restrictive countries, as they develop their own industry and have their own pictures to release, then we won't be able to rely so very, very much on the international market for that degree, 80% of our profits. And it is the goal of these countries to be developing all of their own industries, especially this industry, because as it is, we're only getting 25% of our profits on Chinese films. They want half of the profits by doing co-productions. So as we get less money from these properties, the domestic audience may become more important again.
So what you're essentially saying is we'll get back to where we were once they realize.
No, I never believe in going back to where we were.
Well, not back to where we were, but we'll get back to
forward.
We'll get to a place where perhaps the creators, the artistic talent in the business will have more clout again, because we're not so obsessed with growth overseas, or is that never coming back?
No. What I think we may have to become more attentive to the domestic market, okay? And that may mean that if a bunch of tent poles fail, okay, and we have to become eventually less reliant, if it goes back to 60-40 or 70-30, right? It starts looking like that. They're going to have to kill one or two tent poles at each studio, and that leaves room for movies.
Right.
And that leaves room for gut. So that leaves room for talent. But that's why I think it's going to be a combination of the old abnormal and the new abnormal. We'll never go back to exactly the way it was, because we'll always have a good portion of it be still international, right?
Right. Which I think is ultimately a good thing, especially in the international market.
It's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Globalization has really good things. I'll give you an example if you have a second.
Sure.
When I did The Siege, I could not sell Denzel Washington overseas, and we had to add Bruce Willis, right?
Yeah.
Now, Denzel Washington is a huge international star. It used to be said that, the international market was racist. Well, of course it was racist because it had walls up, right?
Yeah.
It never had black people in their countries
Right.
before. But now that they're exposed to heroic black people, they want them.
Right.
And that goes in reverse towards us. Li Bingbing is going to be the star of Transformers 4. Mm-hmm. We're going to get to know Chinese movie stars, right? This huge Chinese financier named Bruno Wu is doing American-type blockbusters, but based on Chinese stories as co-productions with both American and Chinese cast. We're going to learn more about Chinese culture.
Interesting.
Ultimately, that's going to create some kind of larger understanding between nations who know nothing about each other.
Last question pertaining to libraries. And this is something that I've observed for the last number of years, is that a lot of the studios seem to be so focused on making great big new movies that make their money very quickly, first weekend and then done.
Yeah.
It's almost disposable, and they don't seem to care quite as much about their libraries. And we've had a lot of really interesting DVD companies emerge, like Olive Films and Twilight Time, who are effectively mining the libraries of the studios and saying we can market this stuff, and they're just sub-licensing these things. And most recently, the most interesting one was Paramount cutting a deal for 600 of its library titles that it's going to give to Warner Brothers to market on Blu-ray, because apparently Paramount just doesn't want to be bothered with its library. Yet Warner Brothers is perfectly content to do it. I find this to be a fascinating change. Do the studios not care about the longevity of their libraries anymore? Do some care more than others? What do you read in this? You
just blew my mind.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm thrilled. I love to learn new things. I imagine that someone there, and I could guess who, went through those titles and thought they weren't blockbuster worthy, and somebody thought that was a great decision to make, and maybe in terms of their mandate it was, but somebody at Warner Brothers was looking longer into the future and thought these are still exploitable.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's a trend. I think most studios do see the value in their libraries. I think you have to see the long view and not see this moment in time that only Marvel and DC are valuable.
Yeah.
And
I
anything
concur.
that's written by a YA author,
Yeah.
I think that's the thinking that may have driven that. I'm just guessing, though.
Well, Lynda, this has been an education for me, and it has been a pleasure and a privilege. I thank you, and I have been encouraging on our Facebook page all of our listeners to go out and get your book. There have been a number of threads, all of them sort of, why do movies suck so badly? Why is this so terrible? Why is this so horrible? And my generic post to all of them is, go read the new Obst. And
thank you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have someone understand the book so much and respond to it in this way.
Well, it's again. I think, as I said, I think it's the most important book for people working in the business or who want to work in the business since the William Goldman, and that's I've read just about everything since. So I appreciate it. Thank you, and I wish you all the best with the book.
Thank you so very much.
You got it. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
or rather the book by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. So you do the math and figure out who did most of the work on the book. I don't know. But anyway, it's narrated by Tom Hanks and stars this guy Billy Campbell from The Killing, who's surprisingly good as Lincoln, especially in the wake of Daniel Day-Lewis recently winning an Oscar and being, you're going to compare everybody to him. He does a pretty darn good Lincoln. Certainly his own Lincoln. It's nothing at all like like what we saw in Lincoln. But no historical eye-openers here for me. I didn't go, oh my gosh, really? That's not what I learned in the history books, but it's otherwise it's fine and it's interesting, and it did really, really well on television in the ratings, and that's why we're probably going to see Killing Kennedy next, and isn't Killing Jesus next on his book list? Wasn't that of all the killing things that he's doing?
I don't know. I do not know.
Yeah,
How about killing his career? Bad books.
All right, that's it. We are done for this week. We'll be back next week. Please send us your listener mails. We didn't get to them today, but we will get to them next week. Listener mails, Vox boxes, people who have never sent us a Vox box before. Don't be embarrassed about hearing your voice on the show. You'll be forever immortalized as Mark and I make fun of you, and that's worth everything. So send us your Vox boxes, send us your suggestions for our outros, and send us listener mail at gods@digigods.com. We'll see you next week.